At 42, my own mother introduced me to her hospice nurse as the daughter who stole from us. But what I discovered 3 days later changed everything. My name is Carol and Whitfield, and for most of my life, I believed that love was something you earned through patience. I was a nurse for 22 years at Riverside Memorial in Dayton, Ohio, the kind of job where you learn to read a room before anyone speaks. You learn which silences mean pain and which ones mean fear. I thought I understood every kind of hurt a person could carry. I was wrong. The deepest wound I ever carried didn't come from a hospital corridor. It came from my parents' kitchen table. My husband, Michael, died 4 years ago. A heart attack, sudden, on a Tuesday morning while he was fixing the gutter. I remember the sound of the ladder falling before I understood what it meant. We had been married 19 years. He used to say I had a nurse's hands and a poet's heart, which always made me laugh because I never once wrote a poem in my life. After he passed, I kept his flannel shirt folded on the chair in our bedroom for almost a year. Grief has its own timetable, and no one warns you that it doesn't end, it just changes shape. My parents, Earl and Diane Foster, raised me in a small house outside of Springfield, the kind with a wraparound porch and a garden that my father tended like it was a second job. I was their only daughter. My brother, Gary, was 2 years older, and from the time I was a child, it was understood, quietly but firmly, that Gary would inherit the family home one day, and I would inherit the responsibility of caring for our parents as they aged. Nobody ever said it directly. It was simply the air we breathed. I didn't resent it, not at first. I loved my parents. When my father's knees gave out and he could no longer climb the porch steps, I was the one who drove 40 minutes each way, twice a week, to help him with his medications and his physical therapy exercises. When my mother's memory began to slip, small things first, forgetting where she put her keys, then forgetting what day it was, I was the one who sat with her doctors, who filled out the insurance forms, who learned the names of every medication by heart, because I didn't trust anyone else to get it right. Gary visited on holidays. He would arrive with his wife, Renee, and their 2 teenagers, stay for a few hours, take photographs for his social media, and leave before dinner was cleared. My parents adored him anyway. There is a particular kind of ache in loving people who love someone else more, and doing it without complaint because you were raised to believe that complaining was a character flaw. I want to be honest here, because this story only matters if I tell it honestly. I was not perfect. There were nights I sat in my car in my parents' driveway before I went inside, just breathing, trying to find whatever reserve of patience I had left. There were moments I resented the unfairness of it, the way Gary's absence was treated as understandable, while my presence was treated as obligation. But I kept showing up. I kept showing up because somewhere inside me, I believed that if I gave enough, eventually they would see me. Not just see what I did for them. See me. 5 years ago, everything changed, and it changed because of a missing bracelet, and why Mother owned a gold bracelet that had belonged to her own mother, a delicate thing with a small sapphire clasp. She had always said it would go to me one day, though nothing was ever written down. One afternoon, while I was helping her organize her jewelry box for a doctor's appointment, the bracelet went missing. I remember the moment clearly, my mother's hands trembling as she searched through the same drawer 3 times. I helped her look. We never found it that day. 2 weeks later, Renee visited my mother while I was at work, and by the time I arrived that evening for our regular Tuesday routine, something in the house had shifted. My mother wouldn't meet my eyes. My father's jaw was tight in a way I recognized from childhood, the look that meant a decision had already been made and discussion was no longer welcome. "Renee thinks you might have taken your mother's bracelet," my father said, not as a question, but as a statement he had already decided to believe. "To sell it. Nurses don't make what they used to, Carol, and—" I remember standing in that kitchen, the same kitchen where I had learned to bake bread with my mother, where I had done homework at that same table for 18 years, and feeling something crack quietly inside my chest. I did not raise my voice. I did not defend myself with anger. I simply said, "I would never take anything from either of you. You know that." And I meant it with my whole heart. But belief, once planted by someone people trust, is difficult to uproot. Over the following months, small comments became a steady drumbeat. My mother, in her increasing confusion, began to repeat the accusation to anyone who would listen, to her church friends, to her hospice aide years later, to Gary's children. I became, in my own family's telling, the daughter who couldn't be trusted around money or valuables. Meanwhile, I kept driving those 40 minutes, twice a week, then 3 times, then almost daily as my mother's condition worsened and I never found out who actually took that bracelet. I had my suspicions, but suspicion isn't proof, and I had spent my whole life being taught that a foster woman does not accuse without evidence. So I swallowed it. I kept showing up to a house where I was treated like a suspect because somewhere inside me I still believed love meant enduring whatever it cost. That belief nearly cost me everything. The betrayal, when it truly arrived, did not come as a single dramatic moment. It arrived slowly, the way water finds cracks in a foundation, until one day you realize the whole structure has been compromised without your noticing. It started with small exclusions, family group texts that I was quietly removed from, then reinstated when someone needed something from me, decisions about my parents' care that were made without consulting me, then presented to me as decisions I was simply expected to execute. Gary began speaking to my parents' doctors directly, positioning himself as the responsible child, despite the fact that I was the one who actually understood their medications, their allergies, the specific way my father needed his blood pressure monitored twice daily. Then came the day I overheard Renee on the phone with my mother, not realizing I had walked into the next room to grab a blanket. "Diane, you really don't need to worry about the house going to Carol, and Gary's already spoken to an attorney about the trust. It's practically settled." My mother's soft laugh in response, the kind of laugh that told me she had already agreed to something I knew nothing about. I stood frozen in that hallway, holding a blanket meant for my father's cold feet, and I felt the floor of my understanding shift beneath me. 22 years as a nurse had taught me how to keep my face still even when my chest was pounding. I walked back into the living room, delivered the blanket, kissed my father's forehead, and drove home in silence. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of tea going cold in my hands, and I made a decision that would change everything. I decided I would stop assuming my worth would eventually be recognized. I decided, quietly, without announcement, without confrontation, that I would start protecting myself. I called my old friend from nursing school, Patricia Nguyen, who had left healthcare 15 years ago to become an estate attorney in Columbus. We had stayed close over the years, the kind of friendship that survives distance because it's built on genuine respect rather than convenience. I told her everything: the bracelet, the years of quiet suspicion, the phone call I had overheard. Patricia listened without interrupting, which is a rare gift in a friend, and when I finished, she asked me one question that reframed everything for me. "Carol, and when your husband passed, who was named as beneficiary on his life insurance, and what happened to the equity in your house?" I hadn't thought about it that way before, because I had never once imagined my finances and my parents' schemes belonged in the same conversation. But Patricia was gently pointing me towards something I had not fully considered. Michael and I had paid off our house together before he died. That house, along with his life insurance and a modest but well-managed investment account, belonged entirely to me. I was not dependent on my parents' estate. I never had been. Somehow, in the fog of years spent trying to earn their approval, I had forgotten that my own 2 hands had already built something solid. "You are not a beggar at their table, Carol, and," Patricia said, "you never were. It's time you started acting like the woman who built her own house, because you did." That conversation planted a seed of clarity that would grow slowly over the following months, through discoveries I could never have anticipated, through betrayal so specific it would have been almost funny if it hadn't been my own family, and eventually through a moment at my mother's hospice bedside that would end 5 years of quiet cruelty in less than 4 minutes. The wrong text message arrived on a Sunday evening in March. Nearly a year after that overheard phone call, I had gone to visit my parents that afternoon, bringing my father his favorite lemon cake from the bakery on 4th Street, the kind we used to get after his physical therapy appointments when I was still driving him twice a week. My mother's dementia had progressed enough by then that she often didn't remember my visits, within hours of them ending. But my father still had lucid stretches, moments where the man I remembered from childhood would surface, sharp and present, before slipping away again. While I was in the kitchen washing dishes, my phone buzzed with a text. I assumed it was from my daughter, checking in about dinner plans. Instead, it was from Renee, clearly meant for Gary, but sent to the wrong thread, the one she and I still technically shared from a group chat about our father's medical appointments months earlier. The message read, "The Sunnyvale brochures came in the mail today. I think we should show Earl and Diane the pricing before Carol and finds out. Once they're moved to assisted living, the house sale can go through without her making it complicated. Don't mention it to her yet." I stood in that kitchen, holding a wet dish towel, reading those words 3 times to make certain I understood them correctly. My parents' house, the house I had spent 5 years driving to, the house where I had absorbed years of suspicion and quiet cruelty in service of caring for the people inside it, was being quietly prepared for sale, not to help my parents, to benefit Gary and Renee, who apparently intended to place my aging, confused parents into a facility while dividing the proceeds of a home I had never once been told was for sale. I did not respond to the text. I did not confront Renee. I finished washing the dishes, kissed my father goodbye, and drove home with my hand steady on the wheel, though inside something had gone very quiet and very still. The following week, I discovered the second piece of the puzzle. My mother, in one of her clearer moments, mentioned almost in passing that Gary's lawyer came by last month to look at some papers. When I gently asked which papers, she couldn't quite remember, but she mentioned a folder my father kept in his old roll-top desk, the one from his workshop days, the one I hadn't opened since I was a teenager. I want to be clear about something here, because I know how this might sound. I did not go searching for documents out of suspicion or spite. I went looking because I was, as I had always been, trying to understand my parents' medical and financial situation well enough to properly advocate for their care. That had always been my role, the role no one else wanted, and I intended to keep doing it properly even while being quietly betrayed. What I found in that roll-top desk changed the entire shape of the story. There was a folder, unmarked, containing a draft power of attorney document naming Gary as sole decision-maker for both health care and finances, dated 8 months earlier, a period during which my mother's cognitive decline had already been significant enough that any attorney worth their license should have questioned her capacity to sign such a document. There was also a printed email exchange between Gary and a real estate agent named Kevin Ostrowski, discussing an estimated listing price for my parents' home, along with a note that read, "Once Mom and Dad are settled at Sunnyvale, we can move quickly. Carol, and doesn't need to be looped in until closing." I sat on the floor of my father's old workshop. Papers spread around me, and I felt something I had not expected to feel. Not rage, not yet. Grief. A profound, aching grief for the version of my family I had spent my whole life trying to earn a place in. A family that, it turned out, had already quietly decided I didn't belong in the final chapter of its story. But grief, I have learned, can transform into resolve if you let it settle long enough. I photographed every document with my phone. I did not remove anything from that desk. I wanted no one to ever be able to say that I had taken something that wasn't mine, not after 5 years of being accused of exactly that. Then I called Patricia again, and this time our conversation would set in motion everything that followed. Patricia reviewed the photographs I sent her within a day, and her assessment was measured but unmistakably serious. "Carol, and if this power of attorney was signed after your mother's diagnosis, and if there's any question about her cognitive capacity at the time of signing, this document may not hold up. But more importantly, I need you to understand something about your father's estate that I don't think you know yet. What Patricia told me next was information that had apparently been buried in decades-old paperwork, information my parents themselves may not have fully remembered. Given my mother's condition and my father's tendency to let Gary handle the complicated things. When my father's parents passed away 30 years earlier, the family farmhouse, the one that later became my parents' current home after a sale and repurchase arrangement, had actually been placed in a small family trust, one that named both Gary and me as equal co-beneficiaries, with a specific clause stating that any sale of the property required written consent from both named beneficiaries, not merely my parents' say-so. This document had been drafted by my grandfather's attorney and, through a series of administrative oversights typical of small-town law offices from that era, had never been properly updated or dissolved when my parents later refinanced the property. In other words, Gary could not simply sell that house out from under my parents and split the proceeds with Renee. He needed my signature. He had known this, or at least his lawyer had likely discovered this during their supposedly quiet review of the estate documents, which was very possibly why the plan had been kept from me in the first place. I sat with this information for 3 full days before I decided what to do with it. I did not want to be the villain of the story, and I understood that revealing this too aggressively, too soon, could permanently fracture whatever remained of my relationship with my parents in whatever time they had left. But I also understood, with a clarity that felt like waking up after a long fog, that I was done being treated as an afterthought in a story I had spent my life holding together. I decided to wait, to gather more information quietly, and to let Gary and Renee's plan continue to unfold just enough to reveal itself fully, because I suspected, correctly as it turned out, that people who believe they are operating in secret often become careless. I want to pause here and tell you something about the kind of strength that doesn't announce itself. For 22 years, I sat beside dying patients and frightened families, and a lesson I learned again and again was this: the people who survive the hardest chapters of their lives are rarely the loudest in the room. They are the ones who stay calm enough to see clearly, who gather facts instead of grievances, who wait for the right moment instead of wasting their strength on moments that don't matter. I had spent 5 years being underestimated by my own family. I was about to learn that being underestimated is sometimes the safest place to plan from. Over the following 2 months, I quietly built my case. Patricia helped me file a formal request for accounting on the family trust, which legally required Gary's attorney to disclose any activity related to the property. I also began documenting my mother's cognitive state more thoroughly, with the help of her actual treating physician, Dr. Alan Reyes, who had known her family for over a decade and who, when I explained what I had discovered, was visibly troubled by the timeline of the power of attorney document. "Carol," he told me during a private conversation in his office, "your mother was already showing significant memory impairment by the date on that document. Any competent attorney reviewing her chart would have serious questions about her capacity to consent to something like that." I also learned through Patricia's careful digging that Kevin Ostrowski, the real estate agent Gary had contacted, had already begun informally marketing the property to a small network of investors, describing it as coming soon, motivated sellers, elderly owners transitioning to care facility. My parents had no idea their home was being quietly shopped around like inventory. The final piece of the puzzle arrived in a way I could never have scripted myself, and it happened in my mother's hospice room. My mother's health declined sharply that autumn. The dementia had progressed alongside a heart condition that her doctors had been monitoring for years, and by early November, hospice care became necessary. I moved into a rhythm of daily visits, sometimes twice a day, sitting beside her bed, holding her hand, talking to her even in moments when I wasn't certain she recognized me. It was during one of these visits, on a quiet Thursday afternoon, that my mother, in a moment of unexpected clarity, the kind hospice nurses call the rally, a temporary return of alertness that sometimes happens before the final decline, looked at me and said something I will never forget. "Carol, and I need you to know, I never believed you took that bracelet. I found it years ago in my winter coat pocket. I forgot to tell you. I'm sorry, sweetheart. I let Gary and Renee keep saying it because it was easier than admitting I'd made a mistake. I sat frozen in that plastic hospice chair, holding my dying mother's hand, absorbing 5 years of quiet suffering collapsing into a single, devastatingly simple admission. My mother continued, her voice growing weaker, but her words remarkably clear. They've been telling Gary the house is worth more than we thought. Renee keeps talking about the Sunnyvale place. I don't want to go there, Carol, and I want to stay in my home. I don't understand all the papers your father signed. I gently asked her, my voice steady despite everything inside me shaking, whether she would be willing to say all of this again, clearly, while I recorded it, not for any dramatic purpose, but because as a nurse I understood the medical and legal importance of a patient's expressed wishes being documented while she was still capable of expressing them. My mother agreed. On my phone, in a hospice room smelling faintly of lavender and antiseptic, my mother stated clearly that she wanted to remain in her home, that she had never believed I had taken the bracelet, that she had found it years earlier and failed to correct the record, and that she did not fully understand the documents she and my father had been asked to sign regarding the house. That recording, for minutes and 12 seconds long, would become the single most important piece of evidence in ending 5 years of quiet family cruelty. But I did not use it immediately as a weapon. I used it, first, as confirmation of something I had already begun to suspect. My family story about me had never been about facts. It had been about convenience. 3 days later, everything changed, not through anger, but through the simple, devastating power of truth spoken aloud in front of the people who had spent years avoiding it. Thanksgiving arrived that year at Gary and Renee's house, a tradition that had shifted in recent years now that my mother could no longer host large gatherings. I almost didn't go. Part of me wanted to avoid the performance of a family dinner while carrying the weight of everything I now knew. But Patricia, in her steady way, encouraged me to attend. Sometimes, she said, the truth needs a room full of witnesses to actually take hold. The dinner table that evening included my father, weakened but present, Gary and Renee, their 2 teenagers, my daughter Lily, who had driven up from Cincinnati, and Renee's parents, who had been invited as guests that year. The turkey had just been carved, the conversation drifting through the usual small talk, when Renee, perhaps sensing an opportunity to solidify the narrative she had built for years, turned to her parents and said, loud enough for the whole table to hear, "We're just trying to get Earl and Diane somewhere safe before anything else disappears from that house." The room went quiet in that particular way rooms go quiet when everyone senses a shift they can't yet name. I did not raise my voice. I did not slam my hands on the table. I simply set down my fork, looked around at the faces of people who had spent 5 years believing a story about me that was never true, and said calmly, "Renee, I think it's time we talked honestly about the Sunnyvale brochures and about the trust document for my grandfather that requires my signature before this house can be sold to anyone." The color drained visibly from Gary's face. Renee's mouth opened, then closed. My father looked between his children, confusion and dawning understanding moving across his features. I continued, my voice steady, the same voice I had used for 22 years, delivering difficult news to frightened families. "I have documentation of the power of attorney drafted after Mom's diagnosis, which her own doctor has confirmed raises serious questions about her capacity to consent. I have the real estate listing that was being quietly prepared without either of our parents' full understanding. And 3 days ago, Mom recorded a clear statement confirming she never believed I took her bracelet, that she found it years ago in her coat pocket, and that she does not want to leave her home." I placed my phone on the table, my mother's voice, weak but unmistakably clear, filling the silence of that dining room. I watched Gary's jaw tighten exactly the way our fathers used to when confronted with something he couldn't argue his way out of. I watched Renee's parents exchange a glance of quiet, mortified understanding. My father, weakened but present, reached across the table and took my hand. "Carol," and, he said, his voice cracking, "I didn't know." I signed what Gary put in front of me. I trusted him. He turned to Gary. "Is this true?" Were you trying to sell your mother's house without telling your sister? Gary did not answer. Renee attempted to redirect, something about protecting the family's interests, but the room had already shifted, the way a room shifts when the truth becomes undeniable, and no amount of careful language can rebuild what honesty has just dismantled. I did not gloat. I did not raise my voice, even once during that entire conversation. I simply said, I'm not here to destroy this family. I'm here to make sure our parents are cared for according to their actual wishes, not according to what's convenient for anyone's finances. And I'm here to say clearly that I will not continue being treated as a thief in a family I have spent 5 years holding together. The weeks following that Thanksgiving dinner were not simple, and I want to be honest about that too, because real healing rarely looks like a movie ending. Gary and Renee's plan to move my parents to Sunnyvale and sell the family home collapsed under the weight of both the trust document requiring my consent and the medical documentation questioning the validity of the power of attorney. Patricia worked with a probate attorney to formally establish a proper care arrangement for my parents, one that named me and Gary as joint decision-makers but required unanimous agreement on any major financial decisions. A structure designed specifically to prevent one sibling from acting unilaterally again. My father lived another year and a half after that Thanksgiving. In that time, something shifted between us that I had waited my entire adult life for. He began calling me more often, not for medical questions, but simply to talk. He apologized more than once for the years he had allowed suspicion to replace trust in our relationship. Your mother and I got comfortable letting the easier story stand, he told me once, sitting on that same porch where I had spent so many childhood afternoons. It was easier to believe Gary's version of things than to sit with the discomfort of being wrong. My mother passed away 4 months after that Thanksgiving, in the home she had asked to stay in, with me beside her, holding the same hand that had once trembled searching for a missing bracelet. Before she passed, she asked me to make sure her granddaughters, Gary's daughters, would still know their aunt, would still understand that real family, isn't about who inherits a house, but about who shows up when showing up is hard. Gary and I have not fully repaired our relationship, and I've made peace with the possibility that we may never return to what we once had. But we speak now, carefully, honestly, without the quiet undercurrent of suspicion that once defined every interaction. Renee and I remain distant, though civil, at family gatherings. I no longer expect from them what they are not capable of giving. My father passed away peacefully 18 months after my mother, in a small assisted living facility that he chose himself, one with a garden he could tend, the way he'd tended the one at our childhood home. Before he passed, he made sure his will explicitly named both Gary and me as equal heirs, with a written note, hand-signed and witnessed, stating clearly that the years of suspicion directed at me had been unfounded and that he wished for the record to reflect his regret. I still have that note. I keep it in the same drawer where Michael's flannel shirt used to sit, though I finally donated the shirt last spring, a decision that felt less like letting go and more like making room for whatever came next. People sometimes ask me if I regret how long I stayed quiet, how many years I absorbed suspicion and unfair treatment before finally standing up for myself. I tell them the truth. I don't think staying quiet was ever the mistake. The mistake was believing that my silence would eventually be rewarded with recognition. It rarely is. Recognition, I've learned, has to be claimed calmly, clearly, with facts and documentation and dignity, not with anger, but with an unwavering refusal to keep disappearing inside someone else's convenient story. I am 44 years old now. I have my own home, paid for by my own hands and Michael's memory. I have a relationship with my granddaughters that is built on honesty rather than obligation. I have a friendship with Patricia that reminds me regularly that the people who truly see you are worth more than an entire family who chooses not to. If you are sitting quietly right now, carrying suspicion you didn't earn, holding a family's convenient story about who you are instead of the truth of who you've always been, I want you to hear this clearly. Quiet people don't explode. They clarify. And when the truth finally speaks, it doesn't need to shout. I didn't stop being family. I stopped being furniture.